This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
I just witnessed a plane that appeared to be cruising slightly lower than normal altitude over New York City, and it appears to have crashed into, I don't know which tower it is, but it hit directly in the middle of one of the World Trade Center towers. The plane just was coming in low, and the wingtips tilted back and forth, and then it flattened out. It looks like it's hit at a slight angle into the World Trade Center. I can see flames now coming out the side of the building, and smoke continues to billow.
Looks like 6, 7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Wait, hold on just a moment. We've got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
Okay, the whole building just exploded some more. The whole top part.
Okay.
The building's still intact. People are running up the streets.
You are looking at this picture. It is the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, both of them being damaged by impacts from planes. We saw one happen at about maybe 9 minutes before the top of the hour, and just moments ago, so maybe 18 minutes after the first impact, the second tower was impacted by another, what appeared to be another passenger plane.
That's absolutely inexplicable. There shouldn't be any aircraft in that area, much less something heading what looked like deliberately for the world.
Welcome to a special edition of The Conspiracy Show as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, September 11th, 2001. Now, I'm going to revisit some conversations I've had with 9/11 researchers and whistleblowers over the years who will offer up radically different versions of what happened on that infamous day. Within 3 hours, New York's tallest buildings were reduced to rubble, and the Pentagon, the nerve center of the American Armed Forces, was burning and partially collapsed. Thousands of civilians had lost their lives and were seriously injured, and the entire continent was in collective shock, still trying to make sense of how a supposed coordinated act of terrorism of that magnitude was allowed to take place on American soil. In this hour, the late journalist, best-selling author Jim Marrs joined me back on the 15th anniversary of 9/11. I also spoke to Dr. Judy Wood back in 2016. She's a materials engineer and author of Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. And then, in the second hour, we go back to 2012 and my conversation with the late Phil Marshall, a Boeing 767 captain and former Special Activities contract pilot. Marshall authored The Bigbambooze, 9/11 and the War on Terror. And finally, in hour two, a more recent conversation with a U.S. federal agent, Timothy McNiven, who alleges he was part of a secret military study group that unwittingly planned the 9/11 terrorist attacks 25 years before it happened. First up, Jim Marrs was an award-winning journalist and had over 30 years' experience with several Texas newspapers. In 1999, Jim began teaching a course on UFOs, perhaps one of the first university-level UFO courses in the nation. He also investigated the U.S. Army's remote viewing program 3 years before it was publicly acknowledged by the CIA, and then published Alien Agenda. In addition, his book Rule by Secrecy has been termed an underground bestseller. He also authored The Terror Conspiracy, Deception, 9/11, and the Loss of Liberty. Let's go back to September 11th, 2016. Jim Marrs, welcome. How are you, my friend?
Hey, Richard. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Here we are, 15 years on. Those of us that are still concerned about it, most of us, but it's kind of divided into a number of camps. There's the nanothermite, the controlled demolition camp. There are those who steadfastly cling to the official version, 2 planes slammed into the Twin Towers. 15 years on, has your position moved?
All right. Are you ready? Are you ready for the answer?
I am.
The answer is yes. All of the above.
All right. So
this is why, Richard, I don't understand why that we're having trouble enough getting the great unwashed masses out there to understand that 2 aircraft cannot bring down 3 buildings. Okay, and they go what? And you go, yeah, Building 7, the Solomon Brothers building, it collapsed at 5:30 on the afternoon of September the 11th, 2001, and it was not hit by airplanes. And they go, what? Because a lot of people are still unaware that 3 buildings went down in New York. So we have problems enough right there without squabbling amongst ourselves over, was it thermite, was it nanothermite, was it conventional cutters, was it nukes, was it particle beam weapons, energy-directed weapons? Because the answer is yes. Okay, I'm pretty convinced, Richard, that they used a combination of exotic technology, much of which is not known to the public, which is what allowed them to pull off the 9/11 attack, the 9/11 terrorist operation, and get away with it. Because not only were they using nanothermite, which is not generally known except to the building demolition experts, they were also using small shape-charged nukes. And if people think, well, that's impossible, because most people think of a nuclear bomb, they think of that picture of Little Boy that we dropped on Hiroshima, and it was, this great, big, huge, fat-looking bomb.
Right.
But I recall when I was a kid in the 50s, seeing newsreels where they were shooting atomic artillery shells. They had a big old cannon they called a Long Tom, and they would fire that cannon, and then 10 miles downrange, there would be a small tactical nuclear explosion. So they had nukes the size of artillery shells, which is maybe 2 or 3 foot long, and a foot or 2 around. Okay, that was in the 50s. So the idea that today they have mini nukes that are about the size of a small basketball or maybe an enlarged baseball or softball, that they have those. This is the current technology. The public is not popularly aware of that, okay? So you put these mini nukes in the basement where there is plenty of testimony that there were explosions in the basements of the World Trade Center towers. Okay, I believe it was Mike Pecoraro who said that he went up through the basements after being knocked down by an explosion.
That was a janitor, right? Yes.
And went to a machine shop, and there was a huge drill press that had been just disintegrated. Okay? Now, you take those mini nukes, you put them in the basement with a shape charge. They take out those 47 steel girders that are the spindle, the prop, that hold up those buildings. This would allow them to come down. Then you use your thermite to take care of all of the support beams, and then you use your conventional cutter charges to take care of the rest, and the whole thing would just totally collapse because there's nothing holding up the weight. Now, this is what happens, okay? But now, also, you have to ask yourself, what about the toilets? Let's talk toilets for a minute.
There weren't any.
Have you ever tried to destroy a toilet?
Exactly.
You can beat on it, you can smash it to pieces, you can kick it all around, but it's not easy to destroy a toilet. And think how many toilets were in this 110-story building. Think how many metal filing cabinets were in that building.
Telephones.
What happened to
Did you ever
all
see a
of
telephone? No.
No. Now, you got a 110-story building, and it got hit by a plane, it caught fire, and it collapsed. That's what we're told. It should have left a debris pile of more than 10 stories. Mm-hmm. And yet all we saw was less than 2 stories, and it was just a few desultory ruins and debris. What happened to all of the mass of those buildings? Obviously, there was something else going on, and I don't think we should rule out Judy Wood or others who talk about a directed energy weapon, because I know we're working on that. In fact, Richard, I'm going to cut you in on Liz's secret, you and your listeners. Now, what is it? Okay, Judy Wood actually makes, and I've met her and talked with her, interviewed her, and she makes a very cogent argument for some sort of a energy weapon. The place where I think she's theorizing and may have caused her some trouble is because she, as I recall, she was saying that she thought it may have come from a space-based weapon, from a satellite. Okay? Without going into a long song and dance, I have very good reason to believe that a particle beam disintegrator type weapon was being developed at Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, in the center of the island there. Okay? In 1989, this weapon was tested and used to bring down a UFO. In 1992, it was tested again and brought down a UFO that crashed in South Haven Park and caused a huge big fire there that actually made national news. But, of course, they didn't mention the UFO. They just said it was a big fire. In 1996, I believe, this same weapon was tested 65 miles out southeast of Long Island at a test area designated Tango Billy. And it was a military exercise where they shot a missile at a drone aircraft. And the purpose of the test, of course, what they've been trying to do for years, see if they could stop a missile in flight. And so they fired the missile at the drone, and the disintegrator beam, the particle beam accelerator from Brookhaven, was used to see if they could stop that missile. Unfortunately, the TWA-800, which had a minor malfunction and was late taking off, climbed into the trajectory of this beam weapon and was knocked down in friendly fire. That was the TWA-800. And, of course, they couldn't admit to what happened there because that was our most top-secret weapons testing. Okay? But everybody with the TWA told the truth. People who said there was a missile, there was. People who saw a drone aircraft or a mystery aircraft, there it was. People who saw a light in the sky, that was the beam weapon. So everybody, even the government, told the truth to a limited degree. They said a spark got in a central fuel tank and blew up the airplane, which is true. But why did a spark get in the central fuel tank? And it's because the beam weapon hit the aircraft and fried the onboard computers, and everything was sparking and flashing, and valves were opening and closing, and that's how the spark got in the fuel tank. Now, that was the TWA-800. Now, if they could use that as a disintegrator beam, and they could use it at a target 65 miles to the southeast, I suggest all they had to do was turn that weapon a little further south, and it's only 25 miles to the World Trade Center buildings. And I think that was what was used to spray those buildings and disintegrate. You mentioned yourself, Richard, the fact that there are films showing steel girders that do not fall over. They simply disintegrate in midair.
Dustification is what she calls it. Yeah, like an Alka-Seltzer tablet in a glass of water.
Yep. And it just blows away. It disintegrates. And that's why. So, what happened on 9/11 is they were using exotic technology only known in the inner circles of the military-industrial complex, and therefore they could come out with any screwy cover story, something along the lines of the single bullet theory, and nobody was in a position to say, well, no, that's not right, because here's what it was, because we didn't know. And I'll tell you another thing. There was an exotic technology, was not known at the time, that was used on 9/11 that's very important to understand how that happened. And that is the remote computer capture of onboard flight computers on aircraft.
All right, tell me more.
In the 1980s, I was interviewing a pilot for a commercial airliner, and after the interview, we were just talking, and he said, you know, my job's redundant. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, these new planes, these new wide-bodied Boeing jets, said they're fly-by-wire, they're fly-by-computer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the computer flies the airplane. He said, I'm just there in case the computer breaks. And so I'm going, wow, you know, so I did some study. Well, come to find out this is true. Now, here's a bad analogy, but if you're using a CB radio and you're talking to somebody, and I come along and I have a much stronger CB signal than you, then that's what they call I step on you, okay?
Right.
The person listening is going to hear me. They're not going to hear you because my signal is stronger. They can take stronger signals and they can intercept an airplane's computer, and they can enter that computer, take over the computer. In fact, in my book, The Terror Conspiracy Revisited, I quote the head of British Airways, who in early 2001 said, you know, the era of airline hijacking is over with. He said, because now we can capture the onboard computer remotely, and we can guide the aircraft to a safe landing regardless of the desires of the hijackers or even the flight crew.
Judy has had a conversation with a pilot, I believe it was, saying the exact same thing. Back in the 70s, it almost became a cliche. It was every week there was a plane being hijacked and diverted to Cuba.
Yeah.
And she went back and she said in 1974 there were 50 planes hijacked and diverted to places like Cuba. Then all of a sudden, at some point, late 70s, early 80s, it stopped. And what you're talking about, that's the reason.
That's the reason.
Standard equipment on Boeing aircraft, pilot punches in a code, and he hears someone pounding on the door, let us in, we're taking over. He punches in that code, or she punches in that code, and now the control of the airplane goes to the tower.
That's right.
There's nothing a hijacker can do.
Nobody can control that airplane.
You cannot hijack a modern airplane.
That's true. By the way, and then to add insult to injury, pilots for 9/11 Truth managed to get hold of some of the black box recordings on the flight that they said hit the Pentagon, and what they found was in all the parameters there that the flight deck door had not been opened during flight. Well, wait a minute. If the flight deck door hadn't been open, how did Hani Hanjour get in the cockpit and guide that plane to the Pentagon?
Exactly.
Of course, the bald-faced fact is that no plane hit the Pentagon. There were 82 security cameras all on and around the Pentagon. And that afternoon, before the sun went down, the FBI had grabbed all of that, and we have never seen any of it.
Well, we saw one sort of very fragmented video. I don't know if it came from
15 frames.
Yeah, from a Shell station or something across the road.
Right. And what I love is I remember watching Bill O'Reilly, and for 2 or 3 days he was saying, we now have the film of the plane hitting the Pentagon, and we'll put to rest all of these crazy conspiracy theories, and we're going to show that tomorrow night or whatever. And then they actually ran those 16 frames, and then Bill O'Reilly himself said, I didn't see a plane.
Good for him. Good for him. The other, while we're talking,
see a plane. Also, let me mention this. Richard, you know as well as I do, after every major air disaster, they come along and they pick up every single little piece of that aircraft that they can find, and they take it to a big hangar and they reassemble it, okay?
Right.
So that they can try to determine what exactly caused that crash so we can prevent future occurrences. Show me a picture of the debris of that flight that they said hit the Pentagon, put together in a hangar, and I will shut up about the Pentagon. But you haven't seen it, and you're not going to see it because there was no plane involved.
Well, we all remember, or many of us remember, at least while it was available, and it may still be online, I'm not sure. I'm talking about the CNN reporter Jamie McIntyre, who was on the scene.
Right.
And said there is no evidence. This, again, you always pay attention to the early reports. I learned this from you years ago, Jim. You pay attention to those early reports because then they disappear. You'll never hear from them again. Jamie McIntyre on the scene saying no evidence of a plane crash hitting a building here. And we saw the footage. And again, out on the front lawn there, the Pentagon, No debris.
No.
So what happened? Did some
except for Donald Rumsfeld running along with a little bitty piece he's holding in his hand, and of course I always wonder, did he pick it up or was he putting it down?
Right. So what happened there? Did some Hercules transport plane come by and drop this stuff on the front lawn?
Oh, they had a few pieces ready to go. This was actually a very well-planned operation. Unfortunately, it didn't come off exactly as they wanted it to. I think something happened. The plane went down in Pennsylvania. I think that plane was the one that was supposed to hit Building 7, and so that didn't happen. So at 5:30 that afternoon, suddenly they decided, well, we got to get rid of the evidence because that's where their command center was. So they dropped Building 7. That's after, and I have seen the films, newsreels of the firemen coming down the street, going, "Get back! The building's coming down." How did they know it was coming down? There was only a few desultory fires in a couple of the floors, not enough to bring down a building. That building came down straight down in its own footprint in a matter of seconds, free fall speed. The only way that can happen is with pre-planned demolition. And if Building 7 was brought down by demolition, as stated by Larry Silverstein, he said, we decided to pull it, so we pulled it. Okay? And if that was brought down by controlled demolition, then why is it so outrageous to claim that the World Trade Centers were brought down by controlled demolition?
Coming up next, my conversation with materials engineer Dr. Judy Wood, author of Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. Welcome back. You're listening to a special edition of The Conspiracy Show as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Now, whatever you think happened on that day, you have to agree that there are so many questions that remain unanswered as to how the greatest air defense system in the history of mankind was somehow circumvented. Exactly who was involved. So many questions. Perhaps chief among them, how were the World Trade Center towers brought down? The World Trade Center buildings, Building 7 and others. It wasn't just the North and South Towers, remember. Was it the impact of the jetliners and the heat generated from the jet fuel that caused some sort of a structural failure? That's sort of the official version. But is it possible there was something else involved, some other technology perhaps? Well, this, of course, will be the subject at our live event I just mentioned on September the 11th when Dr. Judy Wood comes to town for an exclusive engagement. But she is here tonight to dive into this a little bit. And it's a great pleasure to have. It's been quite a while since I've had Dr. Judy Wood on the program. She's a Ph.D., a degree from Virginia Tech, a former professor of mechanical engineering. She's research expertise in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, deformation analysis, materials characterization, and materials engineering science. Her research has involved testing materials, including complex material systems, in the area of photomechanics, or the use of optical and image analysis methods to determine physical properties of materials and measure how materials respond to forces placed on them. Her area of expertise involves interferometry in forensic science. She taught graduate and undergraduate engineering classes and has authored or co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed papers and journal publications in her areas of expertise. In the time since 9/11, she has applied her expertise in material science, image analysis, as I mentioned, and a forensic study of over 40,000 images, hundreds of video clips, a large volume of witness testimony, analysis of dust samples, seismic data, and the analysis of other environmental evidence pertaining to the destruction of the World Trade Center complex. Dr. Wood has conducted a comprehensive forensic investigation of what physically happened to the World Trade Center site on 9/11, and based on her analysis of the evidence she gathered in 2007, she filed a federal case for science fraud against the contractors who contributed to the official National Institute of Standards and Technology report about the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. This case was filed in the U.S. Supreme Court in December 2009. To this day, Dr. Wood's investigation and body of evidence is compiled in her book, Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. It's the only comprehensive forensic investigation in the public domain. Dr. Judy Wood, how are you?
Very good. Well, thank you for having me.
And it has been, I'm guessing, well, the book came out in, was it 2007, did we say?
Well, it was written around then, but it was 2010.
Let me ask you first off. Now, this book obviously generated a lot of controversy. Anytime anyone delves into 9/11 and is exploring perhaps, alternative explanations rather than the official explanation, it's bound to generate controversy. But the interesting thing is here, even within sort of the 9/11 truther movement, it created such controversy. I mean, you were disavowed by the 9/11 truther movement, which I find, well, not, it's not surprising. It's such a divisive community. I mean, if you're not with them sort of 100%, then you're against them, which is my understanding. I've experienced that firsthand. But why specifically do you think, even within the 9/11 truther movement, you're such a controversial person?
Well, I don't know if controversial is the right term for it. Controversial is usually a term given that implies doubt. Whether someone is talking about facts or fiction. And anything that I've discussed, and it's in my book as well, is just evidence, an analysis of the evidence as well as parallel evidence. So if someone doesn't want you to discuss the evidence, what do? Distract you. It's kind of like the political scene. They don't want you to discuss the facts. They say, oh, you have boogers up your nose or something.
Right.
They take it off into something unrelated to the evidence. But if you just talk about the evidence, if somebody really wants to know the truth, they shouldn't have a problem with it.
Precisely. And yet they do, which...
So what does that tell you?
Well, it suggests a number of things. One, that the group has been infiltrated by disinformation agents. I mean, that's the one that leaps immediately to mind. And the other thing is, which I've come to realize, is that the whole controlled demolition theory has become almost like a religion. Now, I have a lot of respect for people like Dr. Richard Gage. He's been on the program, and I think he's doing his best to try to piece this puzzle together. But if you suggest that it may not be controlled demolition, it's almost like you become an immediate pariah. They don't want to hear anything else. And I think it's because when people have so much invested in a theory, they almost become defined by it. And if you take that away from them, then who are they? What are they? And that's very threatening to them. It's almost like a self-preservation mechanism. Those are my theories. What do you think?
Well, if you want to control the message, you know that there are going to be people questioning the event. Do you think those who planned 9/11 forgot to plan a cover-up?
At least one. Maybe 5, maybe 10.
Yeah, so build it and they will come. A place for these people to be collected. I call them collection agencies.
That's very clever, yes.
And then you give them a pacifier, and it keeps them out of trouble.
Right.
And the easiest way to control groups is to demand consensus, talking points.
Right.
And if somebody veers off from the talking points, they get excommunicated from the group.
That's a very, very lucent, cogent explanation. Absolutely. Yeah.
So if someone's trying to control your thinking, they want you in a group. And if you're not in a group, it's harder to control people.
Right. Yes.
So,
and here you come along with this, with your evidence that doesn't fit that narrative, and you are a disruptor.
Well, the first thing with the evidence is, in being a forensic engineer, you first have to determine what happened.
Absolutely.
The easiest way to cover something up is to get people to skip that step and just assume what happened and go on and start arguing about how it happened before you've determined what it is.
Right.
And, look at the official story. You know, they're down to step 3 or 4. You know, who did it and why they did it. They hate us for our freedoms.
Right, and we should point out that your work is not focused on who did it, you know, was there a stand-down order, exactly. What was the motivation. You're simply looking at physical evidence based on your background in engineering to explain why those structures failed the way they did.
Or what was going on, and you know, different types of energy could be involved. Let's look at them. One is, you know, like what caused the building to come apart? Was it thermal energy? Did the buildings get cooked to death? Well, you had 14 people walk out of stairway B who don't remember having been cooked to death. You know, so that's out the window. Was it kinetic energy? You know, bombs or gravity collapse. There's a lot of evidence that discards that, which is, you know, people in Stairway B didn't get smashed. They didn't get pulverized. They didn't get squished. They walked out.
Let me ask you on a personal note. What has this meant for you as an academic, publishing this book, Where Did the Towers Go? What does it cost you in terms of, I don't know, career, personally? I'm guessing that this must have been a very difficult decision for you to whether to publish or not.
It wasn't difficult because it needed to be done. And I felt like I was in the best position to do it, not having a immediate family that would be put at risk. Somebody with an immediate family that would be put at risk would have a much tougher time.
Right. And how about professionally?
It's a one-way ticket out of a profession. But I don't like to play pity parties.
I understand.
Yeah, it's about the evidence, and it's this important. I will say that when I decided I was going to do this, I called my mother and told her, and she said, "Well, if you do that, you won't have a career." And I said, "If I don't, nobody will." And I think that's as time's gone on, I think people can see that is where things are going.
Right. Stay tuned. More of my conversation with Dr. Judy Wood, the author of Where Did the Towers Go? After these. Welcome back to a special edition of The Conspiracy Show as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We're going back to August of 2016 for this conversation with materials engineer Dr. Judy Wood, the author of Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. A little bit of a primer here for those not familiar with directed free energy technology. What do we mean by that, directed free energy technology?
Well, I was explaining about how we can rule out kinetic energy being involved as a destructive mechanism, and thermal energy. You know, the buildings weren't cooked to death, nor were they beaten to death, like by gravity collapse or by bombs, you know, blowing things up, moving things and having something hit something else. A lot of reasons for that. You'd have people squashed instead of walking out with, you know, blue sky above them. And also there'd be a seismic signal. There's a lot of other things with it. But what I'm describing as directed energy, the energy was instructed or directed to do something differently than it normally does. The binding forces of matter are usually attracted to each other, but they were somehow instructed to reverse their sign and repel each other.
All right. And let me ask you then, how did you begin to piece this together? What was the first indication for you that this might have been a directed free energy weapon of some sort?
Well, I don't start with the weapon. I don't start with the answer and then go backwards. I start with looking at what happened. And you keep looking and let the evidence tell you what happened. Don't tell the evidence what it's supposed to show you.
Right. Okay, so let me rephrase. What was the first indication for you, and how quickly did it come, that the official version was incorrect? There was something else happening here.
Oh, it came that day. I was in the faculty conference room and looking at the TV set of the building, you know, frothing up into dust, and they're calling it a collapse. And like, wait a minute, you guys aren't buying this, are you? there's something wrong with the story. And folks looked at me like I was crazy.
And when you say this is not a collapse, explain that. What do you mean this is not a collapse? I mean, to the uninitiated, it looked like a collapse.
Well, imagine what a collapse would look like. This piece falls into this piece. This goes to crunch. This goes, pop. Kind of like how an avalanche gets going. It doesn't start 1, 2, 3 all at once. One part gets another part going, which gets another part going.
Right.
Instead, we saw the building turning to dust from top to bottom.
Right, being pulverized as the building.
Pulverized has a specific meaning. It means kinetic energy is involved, a grinding. And pieces were flying through the air and turning into dust with nothing hitting them but air.
And how would you? Now, one of the things I've been told about the construction of the World Trade Center towers is a lot of drywall, pretty flimsy construction, I've been told. This is one of the things that's out there, that this was not a well-designed building. And that it
was pretty well designed, but you have to look at what happened instead of assuming it was a poor construction or assuming airplanes did something to, instead of making assumptions. It takes an awful lot of discipline to just look at what happened.
Right. No, but I'm wondering, because of the amount of drywall in that building, could that not?
Does drywall cause steel to turn into dust in midair?
Right. No, excellent point. But I'm just wondering whether the presence of all that dust in part could be attributed to the fact that so much of the construction was comprised of, as I say, gypsum rock.
There was about 1/5 of the total weight of the building was steel. Steel frame.
All right.
And you can see, in videos, the pieces coming down, and they don't ever hit the ground. They turn to dust before they hit the ground.
Pieces of metal that are turning to dust. Let me just think on that for a moment and let everyone else listen and think on that. Pieces of metal, as they're descending, are turning to dust.
Yes. They look like they're like an Alka-Seltzer tablet, just frothing up into dust.
Remarkable. Okay.
So people don't know what would cause that, so they tend to ignore that piece of evidence. But instead of needing to know, that's what's important about just putting off any kind of assumptions.
Right.
And just going with what the evidence shows. And not feeling the need to play name that weapon.
Name that weapon. Okay. All right. I'm with you.
Yeah, play spin the dial, name that weapon.
Right.
The name of the weapon is not important. Actually, it's counterproductive because, people start getting trendy terms and they name drop trendy terms, and pretty soon they don't even know what the gizmo does.
Right, and pretty soon people are imagining some sort of a laser beam with, Dr. Evil next to it, and then you lose the room.
I do have my name for it, but I hesitate on mentioning it because you might start using that and make initials for it or something. But it's just what the evidence shows.
Right. Okay.
Magnetic electrogravitic nuclear reactions.
More with Dr. Judy Wood after these. Now, back to my 2016 conversation with materials engineer Dr. Judy Wood, the author of Where Did the Towers Go? So what did you call this weapon again?
Magnetic electrogravitic nuclear reactions.
Electrogravitic nuclear reactions. Okay.
In other words, it involves magnetism, electricity, and gravity.
All right. And has this technology been around a while?
Yes, but not advertised in the Sears catalog or anything.
No doubt. Okay.
And what I like to stress, and what's also in my book, I show parallel evidence. In other words, evidence of something we do know that produces the same results. And one example is tornadoes.
Ah, interesting. Okay, tell me more.
Weird things happen with tornadoes, like anti-gravity.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it may follow an electrical signal. If there's a buried cable, sometimes it follows that. And it also dustifies things, or it dismembers things. One video I saw, I think it was like 3 years ago, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, that there's a whole bunch of these tornadoes in the area, and they showed some flying trucks.
Right.
You remember that?
Absolutely, and I remember the movie, about those storm chasers. I can't remember the name of it, but
right. But isn't that strange? It was the trailer part of the trucks.
The trailer part of the truck, right? Okay.
You didn't see dumpsters flying around.
Okay, so where are you going with that, Dr. Wood? What does that mean?
Just looking at themes here, but wasn't it interesting that you had that? Like, where does the wind come from? If you're going to say wind picked it up.
Where does the wind come from?
Yeah, if this trailer is sitting on the ground, what causes it? It's a lot of weight. What caused it to suddenly fly upward?
Right.
How much wind would you need to shoot up from the ground? That doesn't. That doesn't work as an explanation. Pretty soon you do realize it's an anti-gravity aspect of it. They also showed a house that had the roof removed. Big screen television was intact. There was a bookcase with a stack of printer paper on it, and that wasn't dislodged at all. The paper wasn't fluffed up or anything. But the roof was gone.
Right.
Are you going to tell me the wind blew the roof off?
Okay. All right. I see what you're saying. I mean, this is not just indiscriminate. There's a degree of precision here.
Right, and that's just a natural occurrence. Now, do you think somebody hasn't weaponized that?
It would stand to reason. Absolutely. It would stand to reason. There's other evidence that you point, and there's some interesting photographs, and these are available online as well, I believe, and that is vehicles, for example, that were...
Toasted cars.
What did you call them?
Toasted cars.
Toasted cars.
They're toast. They're history. Something happened to them, and you can't fix them. You got to get another one.
Right. And in some cases, I believe there was a taxi cab and maybe a police cruiser. I can't remember if there was a police cruiser, but there was certainly a taxi cab. And it's
right.
Is it over on the Roosevelt Expressway? Was it?
The FDR Drive.
FDR.
I don't know how it got there. Let me say this over and over again because my detractors like to say, "Oh, she claims that blah blah blah." I don't know how that got there, but the damage to it is mighty strange. That the polycarbonate lights are not melted, but the inside of the car is totally toasted. So if you have some rip-roaring fire going on inside the car, isn't it going to make those lights on top like they're on a hot grill?
Right. And there are a number of vehicles around the World Trade Center tower in suffering similar damage.
Over 1,400.
1,400 vehicles?
Yep.
And in some cases, the vehicle, it doesn't show any external distress. It's not like it's scorched on the outside.
Right, there's just weird things like that particular police car. The front door is completely toasted, and the back door is pristine.
Interesting. Now, again, using the tornado analogy, would that explain how those cars ended up on their roof?
Well, whatever's happening is a particular zone. That's when I started realizing there's some involvement of some field effects.
Field effects, okay.
Where something would happen in one place and not another. Like there's a spot on that car that, or one of the cars next to it, where there's a circular spot where it's pristine and around that is totally toasted. And fire doesn't work that way. You don't have something's completely scorched and something's pristine 1 nanometer away. Fireworks is, hot, cold, and shades of gray in between.
Right.
And this is just a pristine delineation, which is an interference type of effect.
Right.
But the vast number of these cars is just incredible. They appeared to go into spontaneous combustion. Let me stress, appeared to go into spontaneous combustion. It looked like fire, but if you have plastic that isn't melted and paper that isn't burning, what is it? Is it plasma or what?
Right. And this technology that was involved, does it leave some sort of a marker? For example, those who swear up and down that it was controlled demolition, and they talk about nanothermite, and they look for, traces of it in the dust and so forth. But does this technology leave a marker?
Well, the evidence is the marker. Now, as for controlled demolition, the buildings were demolished in a controlled fashion. But it was, thermite is not, what did thermite do to the buildings? Yeah, the folks who present that don't ever make that connection. Does thermite cause things to turn into dust in midair?
It does not, as far as we know.
And it's also not used in controlled demolitions because it cannot be controlled. Thermite is a 19th century welding material. It works through heat transfer, and heat transfer takes time.
Right. Well, that's when they stick the word the prefix nano on there, I guess, to sort of
new and improved.
New and improved, yes.
Super, mini, micro, nano thermite.
Exactly.
Nanothermite, because thermite works through thermal conductivity. Nanothermite would be faster, so you have even less time for the thermal conductivity.
And I mentioned trying to wire 110 floors, and you said if you
drive along and you come to a blasting zone, it says blasting zone, turn off cell phones and two-way radios. I
haven't experienced that, but tell me more about that.
Well, they could accidentally trip a wire that's rigged for demolition.
Oh, is that right?
Like if they're going to blow up a side of a mountain to build a road through.
Right.
They wire it up, but if while you're driving through the area, it says turn off cell phones and two-way radios, so you don't accidentally trip it.
And you can imagine how many people would be wandering around with cell phones on Wall Street. So
I can't think of a city except maybe Tokyo that has a higher density of those.
That makes sense, right? So that could have caused it to go off prematurely. So therefore, another reason to probably rule out, wiring that building.
We're getting away from what happened, and there's a particular piece of evidence that was absent on 9/11 that would be required if it was a thermite or a high heat type deal. And do you know what that is?
No, tell me.
Let me see if I can play this clip. Blinded by the light.
Little Manfred Mann here on the program. Okay, blinded by the light, a flash.
Yeah. Wasn't anybody blinded by the light? Nobody saw some huge, bright, like a giant 4th of July sparkler.
That's true. No reports of that whatsoever.
And there was unburned paper fluttering all over the city.
Indeed there was. Hauntingly so. Now, back to you mentioned the field effects, and we talked about the cars, the overturned cars, and some cars were sort of scorched and others were not. But talk to me about some of the other field effects. Talk to me, for example, about weather anomalies.
Well, there's windows are an interesting thing. There were rounded holes through window glass without any other breaks in the windows.
Rounded holes. And how
do you get a glass cutter to even do that?
Exactly. Now, how would the directed free energy technology cause something like that?
Let me back up. Whatever technology was used that day was a technology that was demonstrated to do what was done, without needing to name it at all. But it turns out if you look at what it did, it can be used for good rather than evil. In other words, it can be used to produce free energy. In the same way that on August 6th, 1945, that was evidence of nuclear power plants. No, nuclear power plants did not destroy Hiroshima. But what happened at Hiroshima was evidence that same kind of technology could be used in a good way for nuclear power plants.
Right.
And that's what I mean by directed free energy technology.
Yeah, it's a kind of an umbrella term, isn't it?
Right. The technology that was used on 9/11 and the evidence presented is evidence that free energy technology exists.
Coming up, Hour 2 of our 20th anniversary 9/11 special, and a conversation with the late Phil Marshall, a Boeing 767 captain and author of The Bigbambooze, 9/11 and the War on Terror.
We went to a high point in our building, which is on the 25th floor, and you had a clear view of the both World Trade Centers, and the one tower was smoking hard. And there was another plane that was flying low, and we just looked at it, and before you know it, just kamikaze boom right into the other tower, and mass explosion, windows flying. It was horrible.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
Welcome back to a special edition of The Conspiracy Show as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I met the late Phil Marshall back in 2012 on the Santa Monica Pier while I was shooting an episode of my television show. Phil was a former Boeing 767 captain and former Special Activities contract pilot. He was also the author of The Bigbambooze, 9/11 and the War on Terror, in which he revealed the connection between the 9/11 hijackers and the Royal House of Saud. So we go back to the summer of 2012 for this conversation. Philip, welcome to The Conspiracy Show.
Hey, good evening, Richard. How are you?
Terrific, thank you. And it was a delight meeting you in Santa Monica a couple of weeks back and a real eye-opener.
Yes.
Let me begin by saying this. I finished the book, and I think it's important that everyone within earshot get a copy. Not that I normally promote books to this extent, but I think you've really nailed this one. Like a lot of people, I got distracted with the whole controlled demolition aspect of this unsolved crime. And now, after reading your book, Philip, I am convinced that that is a huge distraction, maybe by design, I'm not sure. But a lot of the information, this is the world's biggest unsolved crime, and a lot of the information that solves it is contained in a report that was issued by the Congressional Joint Inquiry, something that most people have never heard of, fewer have even read. Tell me about the Congressional Joint Inquiry. When was it formed, and who were its leaders?
Yeah, it was right after the attacks, actually. In 2002, the inquiry was formed over the objections of the Bush White House. And Senator Bob Graham, who was the head of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence for the Senate, was the head of that inquiry. And, they did a 10-month investigation into it. They were able to find FBI documents, that showed that the FBI agents had been following the 9/11 hijackers, and that they had been in contact, in close, continuous contact with Saudi Arabian intelligence agents who were acting as their guides through America. They landed in. The inquiry report is fascinating. It shows that two of the hijackers had landed in Los Angeles back in on January 15th, to be precise, of 2000, and were soon met by Saudi agents who were connected to my area of expertise, which is the training of the hijackers on the Boeing airplanes.
Bob Graham, who led the inquiry, he was joined by a couple of top-notch congressional investigators. Tell me about them.
Yeah, there was one. Eleanor Hill was a veteran congressional investigator, and another guy named Jake Jacobson, who was also a former FBI agent, and he had turned into an investigator. He investigated it for the Congress also.
And as you point out, you have two FBIs in this scenario. You have the field agents who are trying desperately to avert or avoid a catastrophe. And then you have this other FBI with asterisks beside it. Explain the difference between the field agents and this other FBI headquarters, I believe you referred to them as.
Yeah, well, the FBI field agents were following the hijackers. They were looking for them, and then headquarters, basically, which was being run out of the George Bush Center for Intelligence. Every time they sent up, hey, we found these guys out training. Later on in the investigation, the hijackers were out in the desert in Arizona training to fly Boeing airplanes, and the FBI field agents actually sent up a message to headquarters, hey, we found these guys out here. We believe they're up to no good. We believe they're doing some sort of a terrorist operation. And, they sent the warnings up to Washington, and when they got there, they literally disappeared.
Now, before we get into a lot of the substance here, which, again, connects the dots, really, between the royal house of Saud, members of the royal family of Saudi Arabia, and the 9/11 terrorists, and this national security state that you're beginning to describe. Let me ask you why we haven't heard about the Congressional Joint Inquiry. If it was, struck in 2002, and you had Senator Bob Graham leading this, and investigators. This is before the 9/11 Commission. Why didn't we hear about this? Why didn't the mainstream media report about this inquiry?
Yeah, well, it was Dick Cheney's work. Dick Cheney actually called Bob Graham on the phone and told him to basically put a lid on it, and, that if he tried to reveal any of the stuff that they ended up redacting in that report, which was 28 pages worth, that they would face charges of leaking classified information. So they threatened him with jail if he was to release any of this information to the media or to the public.
And then Bob Graham would later, a couple of years later, write his own book. I believe it was entitled Security Matters. Did he divulge this information in that book?
Yes, he went into great detail, and he made a bunch of great points. One being that, hey, if it would be so difficult, say you and I, Richard, decided we're going to go to Russia and do some sort of a aerial assault like this in a big operation, how difficult would it really be, for them to detect us in their country trying to pull off some sort of an attack like this. But as we look at this, there were at least 20 people involved in the direct conspiracy. And, the people behind the scenes who were training these hijackers to become pilots, to fly a mission that lasted about 30 minutes long, it really is almost impossible to think that, that these guys could have been in the country training, for this big mission. We know where they went at the beginning. They went to Florida for their initial, basic training in small airplanes. And then later on, in 2001, they all moved to the desert and started flying these, learning how to fly these Boeing airplanes that was used in the attacks.
Let me remind listeners, Philip Marshall, a veteran airline captain, is with us and has led a comprehensive 10-year study into the tactical plan used by the 9/11 hijackers and is the leading aviation expert on the September 11th attack. Let me just set the table here for those just joining us, Philip. So you believe that, and the Congressional Joint Inquiry tends to suggest that this was an inside job. It was carried out in part by the hijackers, but there was obviously participation within the U.S. administration.
Yes, someone, the entire mission was carried out by the Saudi Arabian intelligence agency. And, the 9/11 joint inquiry said that, they were Saudi spies that had seemingly unlimited funds from Saudi Arabia. They knew where they were getting the money from. They tracked down the bank accounts, and they were able to find, that they had shared bank accounts with some of the top people in the Saudi monarchy, including this Prince Bandar bin Sultan was, I believe that he was the initial mastermind, and then they later on farmed out, the actual attack and the execution to the former Saudi intelligence chief, a guy named Prince Turki al-Fawzl, who they found, he left Las Vegas, in the same desert, just a few days after the attacks with 100 men, so they had a pretty big logistical and tactical team on the ground operating in the U.S., and I believe that, they could not have been operating here without some sort of protection from our intelligence community.
You point out that Bandar al-Sultan is or at least you were describing this to me when we were in Santa Monica together, that he is so close to the Bush family that he's known as Bandar Bush.
Yes, and before 9/11, I was actually studying the Iran-Contra affair that I was involved in back in the 80s, and his name came up as a financier in the illegal arming of the Nicaraguan Contras. So the Bush-Cheney Saudi connection goes way back. It goes back at least 30 years to when, these guys have worked together on several covert missions together.
Now, Bandar was, at the time, the ambassador to Washington, was he not?
That is correct. And, we found, he met Donald Rumsfeld I have a picture of him on our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is called the Bigbambooze, and it's a good place to go. That's where we post a lot of our videos and a lot of the media coverage that we believe is nonsense, and then we will rebut the postings that the media makes. But Bandar is he is really he goes back a long way with the Bush family. The missing link here to all the these theories with the Saudis is what I was investigating, and that is basically the nuts and bolts of 9/11. How they actually executed the attack, how they actually trained the hijackers, how they actually flew the mission, how they prepared for it, how they started, years in advance. This thing, there's another group called the Project for a New American Century. I bet you've heard of that.
Oh, yes.
And they basically wrote the blueprint for the post 9/11 world, which was to invade the Middle East and to pretty much clamp down on American society. You can look at this as the Central Intelligence has basically taken over the United States government. They've changed their name to the United States Intelligence Community. They're based at the George Bush Center of Intelligence in Langley, Virginia. And they now control 16 of our most powerful agencies in Washington. And, those include the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, the TSA, Transportation Security Agency, the CIA, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and here's the big one, the United States Treasury, where over $15 trillion have disappeared from our Treasury since the 9/11 attack.
So this is a coup d'etat. It's the second coup d'etat. First, they took the executive branch over in 1963 in Dealey Plaza, and then, I guess, the remaining important departments with 9/11. Phil Marshall is with us, the author of the Bigbambooze. Prince Bandar, member of the Saudi royal family, was the ambassador to Washington, D.C. during 9/11. His wife, did she not write checks to the terrorists?
Yeah, well, they had a joint bank account at the Riggs Bank in Washington that was in business, I think, since 1830 or so, way back before the Civil War even, and this was a big Washington powerful bank, and she had an account there, and so did Bandar himself. And then the hijackers, the people who were supporting the hijackers, were harboring the hijackers on the West Coast, also had a bank account at that same bank. And there was transfers that the Congressional Joint Inquiry found that went from her bank account directly to the people who were aiding the hijackers.
So, this is not conspiracy theory, folks. These are the findings of the Congressional Joint Inquiry, which was largely ignored, muzzled by Dick Cheney. Now, did Cheney not sic the FBI to investigate the members of the inquiry?
Yeah, according to Graham's book, he wrote a book called Intelligence Matters, and he described how they were threatening the investigators, the congressional staff, and everything with lie detector tests, with all kinds of, intrusive, interrogations, and just threatened them, and they muzzled them into silence. And that's exactly what Senator Graham said. They were muzzled into silence by Dick Cheney.
Now, the Saudi agent that met at least two of the hijackers, I believe, in San Diego. Tell me about this individual.
Yeah, well, this guy was named Omar al-Bayoumi, and he was a Saudi national living in the United States, living in San Diego. And on just a couple of days after the hijackers had landed in Los Angeles, he drove up to the Saudi embassy and met behind closed doors at the Saudi embassy and left that meeting and went directly to a small restaurant in Los Angeles where the hijackers were waiting. And now the thing that I found really interesting about him was he was the guy that I was looking for, because when I began my research by putting together the attack. I recreated the attack. I recreated the times that they departed, how they flew the mission, what kind of aviation skills were needed to fly this mission. And I determined that they definitely had contact with Boeing experts. And this guy, Omar Bayoumi, was working for a company called Dalla Avco on the West Coast, but they were based in Saudi Arabia, and they had Boeing aircraft that they had under their certificate. So this was my aviation expert that I was looking for. And he wasn't an aviation expert, but he led them to the company that had training materials, had simulators, had all the things that you would need to, train the hijackers. And I'm sure he had access to Arabic-speaking flight instructors for the Boeing aircraft.
Omar al-Bayoumi. Is an employee of the Saudi Civil Aviation Authority.
Right.
And he met these hijackers. Now, this, again, is according to the Congressional Joint Inquiry.
Yes.
He was someone that the FBI were very interested in speaking to.
Yes.
What happened when the inquiry tried to speak to this individual?
Well, they actually served him a subpoena, or they wrote up a subpoena, and the FBI headquarters and the Bush White House refused to serve him the subpoena.
Why?
They didn't give a reason. They just said...
You cannot interview this individual.
Yeah.
This is someone who had contact with at least 2, perhaps 3 hijackers prior to the 9/11 attacks, had repeated meetings with them, and the inquiry was told by the FBI, by Dick Cheney, don't you dare speak to this individual.
That's correct. That's correct. And the most interesting one is the eventual pilot hijacker for American 77, a guy named Hani Hanjour.
This is the one that hit the Pentagon. This is the one that flew into the Pentagon.
That's the one that hit the Pentagon, exactly. And he flew into town, into San Diego, the day after Bush was declared president by the Supreme Court. And soon after, within the next week, all three of them left the San Diego area, and that's when they went out into the deserts in Arizona and began to train for the mission.
Now, we need to spend some time discussing how this was pulled off, because as you point out in the Bigbamboozle, everything we knew about Al-Qaeda, if there is an Al-Qaeda, up till this point, was all about car bombs and shoe bombs and pretty awkward, clumsy attempts to bring down airliners. Now all of a sudden we're led to believe that they're capable of something far more complex. I mean, exponentially more complex, bringing down or bringing the most sophisticated military and defense mechanism ever known to man to its knees. It just doesn't add up.
Oh, it's absolutely impossible to suggest that these guys, the ones that, and the thing is that there's no evidence when you read over the real evidence in this case, the facts all point to the Saudi operation. And to suggest that some guy that's living in a cave without electricity was the guy that defeated all U.S. national security it's preposterous.
More of my conversation with airline captain and author, the late Phil Marshall, right after these.
President Bush continuing his trek through the Middle East, he lands in Saudi Arabia this morning, where the government there declared a national holiday in his honor. His warm welcome comes on the coattails of a $20 billion arms deal that the U.S. has pledged for Saudi Arabia. The deal gives Saudi Arabia the right to buy precision-guided missiles from the U.S.
Welcome back. Let me crib here quickly from the Bigbamboozle. From the moment the hijackers arrived on U.S. soil, it is well documented that Saudi intelligence agents and employees of the Saudi Civil Aviation Authority provided housing, obtained driver's licenses, and harbored them. After lying low as a sleeper cell throughout the year 2000, they would be led to intensive flight training in the Arizona desert in December of 2000, which leads to the first plausible explanation of the incredible flying performance demonstrated on 9/11. After submitting an 800-page report to the American public, moderate U.S. Senator Bob Graham of Florida, the co-chairman of the inquiry, said, quote, "There was a direct line between the terrorists and the government of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government had provided logistical and financial support to at least two of the 9/11 hijackers while they lived in Southern California." Graham chronicled that FBI headquarters had responded aggressively to Cheney's request that the FBI investigate the inquiry's staff during the investigation, interviewing dozens of members of Congress and their aides. The Bureau suggested it wanted to use polygraphs on some of the lawmakers with the threat of prosecution and jail, of being traitors in a time of war. To Graham, the entire experience seemed surreal. So, the inquiry connects the dots to Saudi intelligence, and then goes on to document how, or at least Bob Graham did in his book, how Dick Cheney and the FBI wanted to cover this up. To me, that's pretty much case closed. You don't have to believe in controlled demolition to know that certain elements within the U.S. government, working with Saudi intelligence, pulled 9/11 off. Philip Marshall, back to this airfield. Is there a connection between this airfield and Blackwater?
Oh, yes. There was an author named Jeremy Scahill who wrote the book Blackwater, and he really chronicled the connections between the number 3 man supposedly at CIA, a guy named Buzzy Krongard. He was the man who was doling out contracts, no bid contracts to Blackwater on behalf of us, the taxpayers, basically. And he was also the head of the same investment firm. He was formerly the head of the same investment firm who placed put option trades, stock trades on 2 airlines. Only 2 airlines were traded in big portions in the week prior to 9/11, and it was by his firm. And the only 2 airlines that they used were American and United Airlines. They traded stock. They put options, betting that the stock price for United and American would go down. They did not place any other stock options on any other airlines.
And that was done through the Chicago Stock Exchange. But how do we know it was Buzzy Krongard?
We don't know that it was from him, but we know that it was from the firm that he once founded. So there is a connection there.
Alex Brown Bank, was that it?
Exactly, Alex Brown.
All right, let's grab some calls. Our good friend, media scientist Nelson Thal checks in.
I agree. The planes are a distraction. I mean, look at Building 7, right? I mean, what are they going to say there? An invisible plane hit the building? But you see this whole situation. But, the real question is, what about the dancing Israelis? I don't think there was just any one, but this is too big for if anybody knows anything about the intelligence agencies, this is too big an operation for just one. I'm sure the Saudis were involved, but there were a lot of
we are focusing
involved, and so far the banned book on the subject, it's also as important as English literature, media scientist. Rich, we should remember Andreas von Bülow's book was banned, and he talked about the CIA and 9/11. So there were lots of agencies involved, and there were dancing Israelis too. And I wonder about what you think about the author of this book. Sounds like an interesting book. I haven't read it, but what does he think about the other reports and what brought down Building 7? I'd be interested in what he found.
Well, the Building 7 thing is suspicious to me. I'm not a building expert. My area of expertise is the airplanes and how they got to where they were on 9/11. I'm not an expert on how buildings come down. But as far as the dancing Israelis, I think we need to look at that Project for a New American Century document real close again, the Rebuilding America's Defenses. A lot of those guys, Paul Wolfowitz was in there, Donald Rumsfeld, these were all Cheney people, and a lot of them are connected to the AIPAC, which is the American Israeli Public Action Committee is what they call themselves, but they're really just a PAC.
As you point, a lot of special interest groups, individuals. We need to point out we're talking about individuals here. We don't want to point fingers at countries or nationalities. Now, as for Building 7, I mean, when I look at that could have been controlled demolition.
Like I said, that's way out of my area of expertise. My area is the airplanes and how they got to where they got.
All right. Let's say hello to Michael in the Beaches. Michael, welcome.
Yes, good evening, Richard and Phil Marshall. I seem to remember years ago hearing some hijacker being quoted as saying that he didn't want to know how to, start the plane or take off, and he didn't want to know how to land the plane. He just simply wanted to know how to fly the plane. And if that is true that he allegedly said this, where would he have gotten the training, and was he one of the hijackers that died as well?
Yeah, now that was in the basic training phases when these guys were learning how to fly smaller airplanes, and they were getting introduction courses in a Boeing simulator down in Opelika, Florida. I believe that's where this incident happened. The guy went in there. They're trying to prepare themselves for the training that was coming up on the airplanes, I believe. So that when he went into that simulator, he said, well, I don't really need to know how to take off. I just need to know how to fly around.
Michael, thank you for the call. You mentioned earlier Prince Turki El Faisal, another member of the royal family. Again, his connection to the 9/11 hijackers was what?
Well, he was in the desert, and they departed Las Vegas. There wasn't anything written up on him until they started looking into these flights that left Las Vegas on September 19th, 20th, and I think 22nd, right after the attack. And there were 3 chartered airliners that left Las Vegas going back to the kingdom. And he was on one of them, and there was 100 men with him. So he had been in the desert at the same time that the hijackers had been in the desert and the people who were harboring them.
Now, it's interesting because some of the survivors or the families of those killed in the 9/11 attacks, they launched a class action suit against Prince Turki El Faisal, did they not?
That's correct.
And what happened with that suit?
That suit was thrown out because the federal judge ruled that, you know, we can't sue a country who is operating on U.S. soil, even though that is illegal for a foreign intelligence agency to be operating on U.S. soil.
And who was the lawyer for Turki al-Faisal?
Well, it came out of James Baker's law firm down there. You know, James Baker and the Bush family are real tight.
He was chief of staff for George 41.
Exactly.
And James Baker and George 41, during the Reagan years, you have concluded were essentially responsible for the Iran-Contra.
Exactly, yes.
Do you think then that James Baker and George 41 were also involved, along with Dick Cheney, with the Saudi Civil Aviation Authority and members of the Saudi royal family in orchestrating 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that this is a long-term plan to take over our government, and I wrote about that in my first book that was titled Lakefront Airport. It's not available for sale right now, but it will be soon. But yes, I started to connect the dots between James Baker, the Bush family, the Saudi family, and all this before 9/11 even started.
All right, stay right where you are. More of my conversation with the late Philip Marshall, the author of The Big Bamboozle, 9/11 and the War on Terror, right after these. Once again, we're dialing it back to 2012 for my conversation with the late Phil Marshall, airline pilot and the author of The Big Bamboozle, 9/11 and the War on Terror, which is a comprehensive 10-year study into the murders of his fellow pilots on 9/11. He explains how hijackers, novice pilots at the controls of massive guided missiles, were able to beat United States Air Force fighters to iconic targets with advanced maneuvering, daring speed, and a kamikaze finish. And he explains the role of Saudi Arabian intelligence agents in 9/11. So would you then conclude that what we witnessed on 9/11 was a coup d'etat?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what has happened to our government since then, and the big thing is that, our justice system has been railroaded. They blame that at the same time they were training these Saudis, the back channels in CIA were floating this rumor about some dark ghost that nobody had ever seen, some spooky guy named, Osama bin Laden, boo, trying to, so they were spreading through the back channels that this guy was getting ready to attack. So when the attack came down, everyone in CIA and everyone in the intelligence community said, "Oh yeah, we know who's going to do who did this. It's this guy Osama bin Laden." And then, but when you look into it, there is not one shred of evidence of any involvement in the planning or the execution of the attack.
Now, Prince Bandar, it was reported on July 26th, again, the former Saudi ambassador to Washington, that he was assassinated. What do we know about Prince Bandar's whereabouts? Is he in fact dead, or do we know?
Well, it's been known there's been rumored for quite some time that he's got major drug and alcohol problems, and that he'd been in some kind of an asylum or some kind of rehab facility for years. It's well documented that he has drug and alcohol issues, and for him, he's been coming and going in the media, and I think it's probably just another propaganda ploy. It might be his plan to escape, just say that, oh, I'm dead, and disguise himself and go live on an island somewhere for the rest of his life. I don't know.
Phil, when it comes to 9/11, skeptics who suggest there's no way it would have been an inside job, it's even, odious and disgusting to suggest such a thing. And they say, so where are the whistleblowers? Well, we've got Senator Bob Graham sort of blowing the whistle, but where are these FBI field agents who tried to tell their higher-ups that this was going on and they were repeatedly ignored? Why aren't they speaking out? Why aren't they more vocal?
That's a good question. In a federal trial, which I have always pushed for, bring this Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to trial. Bring these guys up on a witness stand and let them do it. But, this is what I call a beer bottle cap conspiracy. You've got all these people down in the middle of the bottle that are doing the grunt work, the real Americans, the real people who are honest. But right at the top, they put the director of the FBI in there, and he holds down all that information. So it would be very interesting to get these guys on the stand and hear what they have to really say.
Philip, job well done with the Big Bamboozle. How can folks get a copy of this book? It's very important that they do.
The book is available on Amazon. We have it on Kindle. It's also all throughout Europe and the UK. We have it on Amazon UK and Amazon Europe. So it's available. It's easy to pick up on Amazon.
All right. Terrific job, and thanks for joining me, Phil.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for keeping this subject alive.
It's the least I can do.
All right, my man. Thank you.
Bye-bye. The late Philip Marshall. Postscript. Phil Marshall died a few months after this interview in February of 2013 during an alleged murder-suicide in his home in California. Marshall supposedly shot and killed his 2 teenage children while they slept before turning the gun on himself. However, Wayne Madsen, a former National Security Agency officer, spent a week at the scene investigating and concluded that Phil Marshall and his children were the victims of a black ops assassination, not only for what Marshall revealed in the Big Bamboozle, but also for what he might have revealed in the future. Shortly after learning about this horrible tragedy, I went to my email to search for my last correspondence with Phil. We had emailed back and forth about a half-dozen times between the radio interview and his death. I was curious to know when exactly was the last time we messaged one another and what did we talk about. I searched my Gmail account and the entire email thread with Phil was gone. Now, it's important for me to point out that I never delete emails, except for spam. I never delete emails. This is my incredibly inefficient method of storing contact information. Again, all of my emails with Phil Marshall were gone. I don't know how, I don't know why, and I don't know who may have been responsible. Coming up on our special 20th anniversary of 9/11, a snippet from a fairly recent conversation I had with U.S. Federal Agent Timothy McNiven. Back with more in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. For this next interview, we go back to October 2019. Timothy McNiven claims to work for the U.S. Defense Department as an intelligence officer. In 1976, he claims he took part in a U.S. military study to improve U.S. air travel security. The scenario for the study included a hijacked airliner which would be deliberately crashed into a 100-story building in the United States. Timothy McNiven, welcome. Please explain a little bit more about who you are.
My title is United States Defense Department Intelligence Investigative Office Supervisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And what I do is I'm the supervisor for the intelligence office assigned to the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
Are you now retired?
No, in 97 I had a massive heart attack and I went on a medical leave. Then in 2001, when the September 11 hijackings happened, that activated my callback orders, so I've been active duty since they happened there on September 11th. The Department of Defense is illegally withholding my federal resources, and I can't find a lawyer to help me get them, like staff, members, car and driver, office, and all the stuff I had before I had my heart attack and went on medical leave.
And presumably they're withholding these resources for the reason that we're about to get into.
Right.
What were you doing in West Germany in 1975-76?
I was a member of C Battery, 2nd of the 81st Field Artillery, U.S. Army, and I was an enlisted man in the Army at that time. And then one day I got called to the office where Lieutenant Teague explained to me that I would be taking part in a study to improve the U.S. air travel security. And then he told me that the reason they were doing it was because of the hijacking of the Israeli jet at the Olympics, a recent bombing in Frankfurt, and Mr. Bike's attempt to hijack an airliner to crash it into the White House to get Nixon when he was president. That was, I think, what prompted them to, get the studies going to improve the air travel security.
Why were you selected to conduct this study on preventing, or rather improving, airline safety?
Well, the Department of Defense takes people from different services, like they probably took people from the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines also, and questioned them, to get really complete information on how to stop hijackings from, multiple people. So that, why they chose Sea Battery, they never said exactly. But when they do studies, they, ask a number of different people so they can have a whole bunch of information. On different days, I would get called to the office, and then they would ask me questions about what kind of airplane would be the best airplane to hijack. And I thought that an airplane that was going to fly over the ocean, since they would have, full fuel tanks. But then another person said, well, they have full fuel tanks when they have cross-country flights also.
So you were all together in a room and you were just basically brainstorming? Is that the idea?
Where I took part, they had me in the hallway in front of our office, and then the people who were conducting the study were in back of me. I was never allowed to see the people from the Department of Defense. They had coordinated with Lieutenant Teague on what questions to ask me, and and whatever other person he would work with. So they had it set up so I would never be able to see them, and only a couple times did they say anything.
So on the first day that you took part in this study, you were given a scenario. Tell me about that what that scenario was, which is very key.
We were told that the scenario for this study would be an airliner was going to be hijacked and then crashed into a 100-story building in America. Then we were to think about how we would do it so that they could create the countermeasures to prevent hijackings from happening in the future.
Did they ever name the building, the specific target, or was it just left generic as a 100-story building?
Well, at first it was just a generic building. Then after the second week, they came and announced that the generic 100-story building was being changed to the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City. And Sergeant Henderson told us in the hallway that when Lieutenant Teague heard this, because he's from Long Island, New York, that he said that he was able to do it because it was his orders, but it was weird to be ordered to plan to blow up your own hometown. It shook him really bad.
They also asked you specifically, you mentioned, you thought it would be, given the scenario, you would want to use a transatlantic flight because it was the plane would be full of fuel. Someone else countered, well, so is a continental flight. They're also filled with fuel. But then they asked you specifically what type of plane, and your answer was what?
A Boeing airplane, because my two older brothers had worked for Boeing's, and they had told me that Boeing's had the one lock, one key security system so that no one would ever get locked out of their airplane. for losing the key. There was only one key for the Boeing lock.
You're putting yourself in the place of a hijacker, and you're saying, well, wait a minute. The plane to hijack is a Boeing, because if I get a hold of any Boeing key, it's going to work on any Boeing plane.
Right.
Then came the subject of weapons. If the hijackers are going to overpower the crew, or if they're going to, commandeer the plane, you had to think about, well, what type of weapons would the hijackers use? And you came up with
a box knife to use as a weapon, because when I worked at this company as a machine shop in California, this one guy, he punched his hand in the press and it cut an artery. And I had heard that when you cut an artery, the blood squirts out. And, I had never seen it. So when it happened, I'm standing there in total shock, just watching this blood squirt out of his hand. And one of the other employees had to yell at me to go get the manager, because he saw that I was completely spellbound by this blood squirting out. So I said, well, since it shocked me so badly that the people on the airplane, if they had blood squirted out on them, they would probably be, terrorized kind of like I was, stand there in shock. So that's what I said on the box knife. But when they asked how to get it on board, Sergeant Middleton said he had a relative that worked at a airport, and he said that because of all the drug smuggling on the airlines, that the people would come in and out of the luggage area. They'd go on the planes and stash, drugs on the planes, and the people that worked there didn't pay any attention to them, because they knew if they bothered these drug dealers that were putting their drugs on the planes, that, they'd get a visit at home. So he said it'd be an easy way just to have someone, carried on through the luggage area before the flight took off, because they didn't keep people out of the area.
You had initially suggested plastic box cutters to avoid the metal detectors, but your colleague suggested that wasn't necessary. They could be placed on the plane in advance.
Yes.
So you're suggesting then, under your scenario, the best way to commandeer the plane, to get everybody's attention, to instill fear, and then control the passengers on board those doomed aircraft, was to take those box cutters and sever the arteries, the jugular veins of several people in one of the seats, and with the blood squirting out. It's horrible to imagine, but that would cause so much fear, and everyone would take notice immediately that's how they would. Yeah. Okay. Now, I've never heard. Are there reports that on 9/11 that the jugular veins were cut and that's what happened?
Well, that's what they said happened, and I was thinking that with all the things that we talked about in the study then happening, or supposedly happening on September 11, that perhaps the study wasn't to prevent hijackings, but to help create a cover story for some type of nefarious attack by the Washington, D.C. politicians.
All right, I hope you enjoyed our 9/11 20th anniversary special. Thanks to Ryan White and Carlos Cagina. I'll be back next week with a brand new show. Until then, so long for now. Good night.